De que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito, nada.
In 2002, when George Bush asked the U.S. Congress for war powers in order to attack Iraq, only 4 members of the Congressional Black Caucus voted in favor. Our team at the Black Commentator called these 4 people the 4 eunuchs of war. Now fast forward just 9 years to 2011, in the age of Obama, fully half of the Congressional Black Caucus, 20 members, voted against a resolution that would have halted the U.S. bombing of an African nation, Libya. This is an outcome that would have been unthinkable under George Bush just a few years before. It was even more grotesque when it's remembered that while these 20 black members of Congress were voting to continue bombing Libya, President Obama's jihadist rebel friends were carrying out a race war on the ground in Libya, purging the country of black Libyans and African migrants and massacring them by the thousands. But that didn't change the minds of half of the Congressional Black Caucus. Only a decade earlier, in 2003, just 6 weeks before the Iraq war began, the Zogby poll did a survey that found that only 21% of blacks supported an attack on Iraq. Huge majorities at the same time of white men were for the war, and majorities of white women and nearly half of Hispanics were also for a war against Iraq. But when the Zogby poll asked the question, would you support an invasion of Iraq if it would result in the death of thousands of Iraqi civilians, only 7% of blacks said yes. And that was a reaffirmation of what pollsters had found consistently ever since blacks have been included in the polling process. They have found that African Americans are the group most consistently opposed to U.S. military adventures abroad. And that is because historically we have not trusted the motives of the United States, and we never have. That is, until a black man came to sit in the White House, and suddenly those motives were seen as benign.
Rest in peace, Comrade Glenn Ford, an amazing revolutionary. Every time I hear his speeches, his voice, I always get goosebumps. I always remember fondly of meeting him and knowing him back when I lived on the East Coast. Shout out to Glenn Ford. Shout out to Black Agenda Report. Shout out to Black Alliance for Peace. Long live Glenn Ford. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 61, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Today, what are psychological operations, or as we call them in short, PSYOPs? We're exposing these PSYOPs and their central role in 21st century imperialist propaganda. We're going to explain what they are, why they're not some crazy conspiracy theory that a lot of people like to say, because when you even say psychological operation, a lot of the liberals are like, oh my God, here we go again. But if we look into documents, videos, there's a whole branch of the U.S. Army, of U.S. intelligence devoted to psychological operations. And later on in the show, we're going to talk about and show clips from some of these conversations that take place and how they are and how they've been used throughout history. In particular, how empathy, how love for your fellow human beings, love for humanity is used and weaponized to support wars, sanctions, and regime change. And also how imperialists subvert social justice movements and racial justice movements for their money-making agendas. So we're going to get into all of that. Joining me today are three amazing comrades. Comrades Erica, Caines, Salifu, Mack, and Chris. Erica is a poet, writer, and organizer in Baltimore and the DMV area. She's an organizing committee member of the Anti-War Coalition, the Black Alliance for Peace, as well as an outreach member of the Black-centered Ujima People's Progress Party. Erica founded Liberation Through Reading in 2017 as a way to provide Black children with books that represent them. Please make sure to follow, support, and share Liberation Through Reading. How's it going, Comrade Erica?
Peace. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being on, Erica. It's always a pleasure to have you, always bringing that fire analysis, especially when we're talking about propaganda in the 21st century, especially when it comes to subverting legitimate movements for justice and using them, rebranding them for empire. Also joining us is Comrade Salifu, Pan-African socialist and editor at Hood Communist. Shout out to Hood Communist, member of Black Alliance for Peace, the AAPRP, and the Low Country Action Committee, which is a Black-led grassroots organization dedicated to Black liberation through service, political education, and collective action in the Low Country of South Carolina. Shout out to South Carolina. Recently traveled to Cuba in November, I believe, of last year with IFCO Pastors for Peace on a friendship caravan carrying medical supplies from Miami to Cuba as a show of solidarity with the Cuban people. How's it going, Comrade Salifu? So great to have you back on.
Yo, what's up, y'all?
Good to have you back on, Comrade Salifu. Always also bringing that amazing analysis. And last but not least, my homie, my compañero Chris Durán is a student and community organizer working with Free 'em All New Jersey. Also works with several other campaigns to free U.S.-held political prisoners and prisoners of war. Chris is a first-year graduate student at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU, also of Chilean and Soviet roots. How's it going, Comrade Chris?
What's up? I'm glad to be back.
Great to have you back on, Chris. The last time I had you back on, we were talking about the Democrats and the Republicans. And it's funny, Chris, I always have conversations with him about, because we both went to the same school. We both went to NYU. And we know some of the vibes, the liberal imperialists who try to act like they're on the left, but they support imperialist regime change. Even some quote unquote indigenous professors promoting war and sanctions against indigenous presidents like Evo Morales. So we'll get into all that later on. Just some interesting stuff. But one of the things that I think is important to mention, we're talking about psychological operations. And when you say that, right, a lot of times people don't know what that is. They've heard of it in some liberal documentary about conspiracy theories, or they think it's not real. There's this interesting Wikipedia page, and I know before you say it, you're going to have some liberal professor being like, Wikipedia is not a reliable source. And it's not always, right? I'm not here to 100% defend Wikipedia, but there's some interesting information. I think it's a good starting place for doing research. And by the way, a lot of the information on this Wikipedia page, psychological operations, cites directly the U.S. Army and armed forces and all of this. So there's a whole branch, the Special Operations Forces Command, the 4th PSYOP Group. There's the Air Force and Army Division, Marine Corps, Army Reserve, Navy Reserve. So in all of the different branches of the U.S. Armed Service, you have psychological operations officers whose entire job is to manipulate minds, to manipulate people into war, and how to create talking points to favor war, right? Like they're doing right now with Ukraine and Russia, like they've been trying to do in Cuba, like they've been trying to do in in Iran, in Syria, in Libya in 2011, right? All this coup attempts and horrible atrocities against African peoples in Libya. And so just to kind of like quickly go over this, psychological operations, PSYOPs, are operations to convey selected information and indicators to audiences to influence their emotions, motives, and objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. The purpose of U.S. psychological operations is to induce or reinforce behavior favorable to U.S. objectives. They are an important part of the range of diplomatic, informational, military, and economic activities available to the U.S. They can be utilized during both peacetime and conflict. There are 3 main types: strategic, operational, and tactical. Strategic PSYOP include informational activities conducted by the U.S. government agencies outside of the military arena, though many utilize Department of Defense assets. Operational PSYOPs are conducted across the range of military operations, including during peacetime, in a defined operational area to promote the effectiveness of the Joint Force Commanders' campaigns. And tactical PSYOPs are conducted in the area assigned to a tactical commander across the range of military operations to support the tactical mission against opposing forces. This is the part that I find really crazy. PSYOPs can encourage popular discontent with the opposition's leadership, and by combining persuasion with a credible threat, degrade an adversary's ability to conduct or sustain military operations. They can also disrupt, confuse, and protract the adversary's decision-making process, undermining command and control. When properly employed, PSYOPs have the potential to save the lives of friendly or enemy forces by reducing the adversary's will to fight, by lowering the adversary's morale and then its efficiency. PSYOPs can also discourage aggressive actions by creating disaffection within their ranks, ultimately leading to surrender. So some really crazy shit, basically mind control. Here's some of the examples, mainly in Cold War, in Korea, during the Korean War, the imperialist war against the DPRK was used. In Guatemala, the coup against Jacobo Arbenz, in Vietnam, in Nicaragua, the Gulf War, which we'll go into later on. And there's just so many different areas. I suggest people check out this page. And again, right, I'm not here to say that Wikipedia is necessarily the most accurate or reliable, but most of this is explicitly linked and citing U.S. Army propaganda and intelligence. And another interesting part of this, in order to create a successful PSYOP, the following must be established. 1, clearly define the mission so that it aligns with national objectives. 2, need a PSYOP estimate of the situation. 3, prepare the plan. 4, media selection. 5, product development. 6, pre-testing. 7, production and dissemination of PSYOP material. 8, implementation. 9, post-testing. And 10, feedback. So it's very systematic, very thorough, extremely articulated by the U.S. And a lot of this, if you read into this, a lot of this talks about, especially during the Korean War, how in South Korea, they use Christian groups like the Moonies, right-wing evangelicals, to spread propaganda, anti-communist propaganda against the North. In Vietnam, they did something very similar. And a lot of times as well, how it was used in modern times to support invasions. You know, we can talk about Iraq, right? The so-called weapons of mass destruction. We all remember that, right? When they were saying that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Libya, that they were claiming that Gaddafi was murdering his own people, that he was a dictator. with Venezuela, with Cuba, with Nicaragua, so many places that that it's been tried and tested. So it's something that I think is just interesting to really discuss and go over, because I think it's something that doesn't really get a lot of attention. So before we get into the discussion, what I want to do is I actually want to play an ad. This is an ad from the U.S. Army, right, from straight from the horse's mouth, in an attempt to recruit people to become psychological operations specialists, talking about war and imperialism and manipulation, with some trendy music in the background. So we're going to play this, and we're going to talk about psyops and their role in imperialism.
Persuade, change, influence. That is the motto of the U.S. Army's Psychological Operations Regiment. Military operations do not always require lethal force on a battlefield. Military information support operations can employ non-lethal actions and messages to attain military objectives. PSYOP soldiers are highly skilled, specialized operators whose work encompasses executing psychological actions in the development and dissemination of influential messages.
I think the most important thing for a PSYOP soldier is to be very well-rounded. It's an ability to fit into any environment.
Trained in persuasive techniques, PSYOP soldiers use their skills to change attitudes, behaviors, values, beliefs, and influence foreign audiences through executing actions in the delivery of messages utilizing a variety of techniques.
Tactical PSYOP team will usually be attached to a special forces team, and what they do is they look at what those teams are trying to do, and in order to support that, they find behaviors of the local populace that they can change to best accomplish that mission.
While performing military information support operations, PSYOP soldiers conduct thorough research and analysis of the intended audience. They employ specific communication methods using a variety of techniques, technology, and mediums to develop and deliver messages which will have the greatest impact and influence. These methods often incorporate the use of state-of-the-art multimedia products that convey U.S. policy and national objectives. The PSYOP soldier is a critical component of the U.S. Army Special Operations Command.
To be a successful PSYOP soldier, I think somebody has to be dedicated, they have to be motivated, they have to be intelligent, and they have to be able to work not only in a team, but also independently and be a free thinker.
Special Operations soldiers deploy worldwide on missions that range in size and scope from the tactical up to the strategic level. Smaller tactical or battlefield level operations are used to secure immediate or short-term goals. Strategic level operations encompass broad national security objectives during both peacetime and war. Typically, PSYOP soldiers deploy in small teams of 3 to 12 soldiers with an average mission length of less than a year. PSYOP soldiers may be employed in operations which support conventional forces, unconventional warfare, or counterinsurgency techniques, and in conducting raids, peacekeeping operations, evacuations, and rescue missions. When deploying, you may also assist other government agencies in support of foreign governments, humanitarian assistance, and drug interdiction.
So a lot of crazy stuff. And yes, that is a recruitment ad from the U.S. Army, straight from the horse's mouth, to become a psychological mind control magician wizard for imperialism. A lot of crazy stuff. Comrade Erica, your thoughts, reaction on all this, on PSYOPs, and how the imperialists use mind control to manipulate us into supporting their imperialist regime change.
Yeah, I want to just note that I appreciate you opening this up with Glenn Ford, because a lot of my understanding about how these things work, how they interact, how we become susceptible to them is through Glenn Ford's work. So I do appreciate you opening it up with that. But yeah, I think a lot of what I discuss as of late that I'm focused on with highlighting imperialism as the primary contradiction has to do with the ways that we are manipulated into manufacturing consent for war. The video itself shows how the Army uses it elsewhere, but I think what I discuss mostly is the ways that we are susceptible to it, because the video doesn't really talk about how the ways the state uses PSYOPs on us with the same exact mechanisms, the exact same mechanisms. So I thought that was something interesting, because there was a lot of things that was noted And I'm like, yeah, they do that here too, and that's exactly how they manufacture consent for war on this side, as they're manufacturing consent to like overthrow leadership or yeah, to stage coups and and not acknowledge elections and such. Just the same way that they do it overseas is what we see it happening with us. So those were some of my initial takeaways. But I am more so intrigued by how common it is. Because the recruitment video was just very like, well, I always tell people to watch the like listen, read what the army is saying, watch those Atlantic conferences, because they are very much out in the open about the ways that they do things. Like they do not mince words. But I was just a little like, wow, they're like step by step and telling you like the way that it's presented is like, this is a good thing though. We're like saving democracy. So yeah, those were my
Yeah.
initial takeaways.
Yeah, most definitely. They tell you straight up, and that's the thing. Like a lot of this stuff, if you would have said this like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people would have thought you're crazy. People would have thought, you're a conspiracy theorist. But this is all information that has been released. It's public. It's out there. It's not even hidden in plain sight. It's just in plain sight, and it's something that is important to research because it's still happening today. A lot of times people only think about it in the past, right? They're like, oh, that happened during Vietnam, that happened during Korea. It's not happening today, but what do we see going on today, right? We see the US trying to provoke a war with Russia and Ukraine. We see the US trying to provoke a war with China in the Xinjiang region with the Uyghurs. US trying to promote coups in Cuba. And turning to you, Comrade Salifu, you were recently in Cuba not that long ago. And obviously you had a lot of great analysis of the situation, imperialist regime change against the Cuban revolutionary government. This is a image that went viral during the so-called quote unquote protests that were going on a few months ago that used the hashtag SOS Cuba, that used the hashtag Patria y Vida, and another color revolution style attempt. And for those of you listening, it's a right-wing gusano in Miami, and it has a sign that says U.S. Southern Command, please help my people in Cuba. So complete fucking nonsense, complete just asking for invasion. And this was circulated all over on Getty, on all these mainstream media outlets, as trying to create, like, because you see him, you see like, wow, like this guy needs help, right? They're trying to hijack this natural human emotion of empathy, which is good, and subvert it for regime change. So your thoughts on this, and maybe if you want to give any examples of how the psychological operations are used against Cuba.
Yeah, this during that whole commercial, I could not help but think about one of the oldest operations that the U.S. government has implemented against Cuba. That I'm not sure they term it a psychological operation, but I think it absolutely was Operation Peter Pan. I was thinking about that the entire time I was watching the video, and for people who don't know, Operation Peter Pan was basically this creation of that really came out of the United States, really came out of Miami, to be honest, where this idea was spread across the island that Fidel Castro was going to separate parents from their children, and the United States collaborated with the Catholic Church and other institutions that house sort of like, well, I guess you could consider like middle class Cubans to be a part of. So like the lawyer sector, the doctor sector, the engineer sector, but really the Catholic Church was a huge part of this. So it started as this really small idea that the Castro regime had this idea to separate parents and children. Like children in Cuba were about to enter this era of like forced slavery, basically, and like their parents weren't going to be able to do anything about it. This is before the Cuban Revolution had declared its sort of communist, socialist character. And what the United States did was grew that rumor. It fed that rumor. It fed that idea until it got so big that people were willing to fund and support programs that would fly and boat children directly out of Cuba and into Miami. And so what you have in Miami, even until this day, is sort of this thing called the Peter Pan generation, this generation of Cubans who were separated from their families because of this, like because of this operation, because think about it, you are a person on the island and you're hearing like people are just walking around you whispering, saying like, this is what's about to happen. And obviously the people who kind of fell victim to this thing more so were sort of the more middle class aspirant or middle class, Cubans, but it was still this thing that played on his hearts and minds of like all parents want their kids to be safe, right? People were really deluded into believing this thing that was never intended to happen, and it absolutely came true. What does it say? 14,000 Cubans, kids who many of them in Miami right now are straight up gusanos who continue to buy in to this thing that happened to them. But then there's also many who feel this like huge sense of rage about being separated from their families. A lot of these kids came to the United States and were placed into homes that were no good for them. They tried to assimilate them into, Euro-American culture, Anglo-Saxon culture, try to beat their language out of them. These really abusive situations, faced in lots of bullying and stuff at school. So it was not just that act of being separated from your family, but then also coming to this new place where everything about you was like actively trying to be erased from who you were. That is like, I think on like a large scale, an example of what psychological operations can do, because even to this day, you will get gusanos who come out and deny the very evil root of this thing that happened to these people. Like it is very clearly stated. It was a rumor. It was a lie. This was Fidel Castro never intended to do this. But even until this day, there are people who are convinced that this thing was a good thing that the United States did. So
definitely. No, well said. I'm so glad you mentioned Operation Peter Pan. It's one of those that almost never get mentioned and not a lot of people know about. And it's just crazy. I think Cuba in particular has had a long experience with the attempts to use psychological operations to overthrow the revolutionary socialist government. And I was looking at the history of this guy named Edward Bernays, who is a Zionist who supported the state of Israel, and he is called the father of propaganda. And basically, he created the campaigns to make cigarettes popular among pregnant women and called them freedom torches, using film to unite cigarettes with women. And he basically worked for Marlboro and all these big tobacco companies and was like, we need to get cigarettes into the hands of all these cool protagonist actors in the films so that people equate smoking a cigarette with being cool and with being hip. And he was the mastermind behind that, knowing full well that cigarettes cause cancer and all this stuff. These examples of manipulation and mind control. And he also pioneered the concept of using media for coups in Guatemala, for example, against Jacobo Arbenz in the 1950s. He worked for the United Fruit Company. He advised a lot of U.S. presidents on how to use psychological operations to do this. And turning to you, Comrade Chris, one of the things we talk about a lot is how in academia in particular, you have quote unquote indigenous professors who claim to be indigenous or claim to be in support of indigenous rights, who basically simp and basically support empire, right? They're just like complete puppets of empire. And they'll use, for example, Bolivia, what we're seeing now on the screen. This is an image from 2019 in the lead up to the coup against indigenous President Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, a majority indigenous country. And he was basically the victim of a psychological operation through social media, through propaganda, where they use quote unquote indigenous peoples. And funneled this right-wing protest against him. And, the sign in the background says resistance against the dictatorship. They were using stuff like indigenous rights against an indigenous president. And it was a psychological operation in many ways, because they're playing upon these ideas of indigeneity and racial justice against a president who himself is indigenous and is promoting indigenous liberation. But obviously they're doing this from the right wing, from Empire. So Chris, maybe you can talk a little bit about, how academia plays a role into this, like into the psychological operations, and how they weaponize identity, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. We see as well Yaqui Perez in Ecuador, an indigenous man who was opposed to the leftist leader Correa. Your thoughts on all this?
Well, you're probably gonna get me kicked out of NYU now. No, but
canceled.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I can't help, thinking about when all this stuff comes up is like how much academia and like how much also sort of like the nonprofit or like NGO, industry plays into this. And
yep.
Like one of the biggest talking points within, I've seen, especially with like Yaqui Perez and Evo, is like, for example, like the talking point of like extractivism or like neo-extractivism, and how that's kind of used as like, now that's the point. That's the talking point to basically say, to give cover to these sort of regime change operations from the left. And I think that, that's one of the most like insidious parts of that, is that it really does appeal to like what would be leftist forces, or otherwise, mostly working class forces in these countries. And so, like, for example, well, the thing is, like, everyone in NYU who's like a part of like this so-called Latin American Studies program, everyone calls themselves like a Marxist, but somehow there's no like grounding in anything, in either any work here nor overseas. And you find out most of their connections are to like these sort of think tanks, to the things you're funded by the Rockefeller brothers, these sort of very distinctly neocolonial institutions that are then promoting human rights. And then when you challenge them on that, they only say, oh well, NGOs are like naturally good, it's just we just have to use them. It's like, well, they only exist because of the World Bank and the United States' attack on the sovereignty of these countries throughout the 20th century. And even before that, like when Comrade Salifu was talking about Operation Peter Pan, I can't help but think they ran a very similar operation in Chile in the lead up to Salvador Allende's election in 1971, where they basically said, okay, all these kids, they appealed mostly to Catholic mothers, and they said, okay, all the children are going to be sent to Cuba, and have hammer and sickles stamped on their foreheads, and intentionally spreading rumors of what's going to happen if the country goes communist. And yeah, I just think that I don't know, it's very apparent, like when you see again the line of extractivism, or like the deliberate uses of like identity, or queer politics, or words like decolonization, when they don't actually merge it together with any actual revolutionary analysis. They purposely leave out certain revolutionary texts or thinkers. And again, like the appeal is primarily to people who are entering academia within these spaces here that, are either probably looking to do something good, who are looking to go, they're going into things like Latin American studies, they're going into these sort of quote unquote ethnic studies fields, and, they just get filtered right into the whole NGO complex.
Yeah, definitely. I had the same experience as well. And a lot of times that's sort of the purpose, right? It's the controlled opposition. And I think that's something that the imperialists understand very well, is that in order to maintain your empire, maintain your system, you have to control the opposition, right? Because naturally, when you have an order or a system in place that benefits you, there's always going to be the law of the dialectic, right? There's the antithesis. There's always going to be something that opposes you, something that challenges you in your order. So instead of allowing somebody else to form that independently to overthrow you and your system that helps you make money, why don't you just create it? Why don't you just maintain it and keep it in academia, keep it in the NGO industrial complex, keep it in these liberal institutions, so that in appearance it seems, oh, you know, we have this opposition that's, you know, thriving and they're speaking out, but they're really just in favor of empire, right? The Democrats and the Republicans, the NGO industrial complex, you know, we're going to fight for power within the empire and all these kind of different things, right? And it's, you know, some people have referred to it as the Hegelian dialectic or the controlled opposition, but that definitely plays a big role in psychological operations, because it makes it seem like there's this authentic opposition to the order of injustice, but in reality, it's just a controlled fund. It's like an exhaust pipe, right, for a car. If a car didn't have an exhaust pipe, it would just blow up. So you need that exhaust pipe to let out some of that air so that the car doesn't blow up. And I think in many ways, the liberal NGOs are like that. I think one of the most, you know, just talking about some of the images, and I think an underlying theme here that y'all have mentioned is children, the weaponization of children and empathy. This is an image from 2014 from Syria. This was actually considered, I think, one of the Time magazine's like most important pictures of 2016 or something like that. But basically, this is from Syria. This is from, if you guys remember a few years back when under Obama, the US was trying to find any way to invade Syria. They were saying that President Bashar al-Assad was carrying out chemical weapons attacks, that he was gassing and bombing his own people and children. And this image came out of a young boy who was hurt, right, in this attack that took place in Syria. Well, it turns out a few years later, so there was all this coverage. You're like, look, this little boy, he's the victim of Assad. This is why we need to go in there, invade, and kill Assad. And they're using empathy. They're using children. Like, how fucking demonic, diabolical is this? You know, they're using children. And so it turns out years later, nobody followed up with it. Turns out that, first of all, one thing, this boy and his father are actually Assad supporters. Like, they actually support Assad. And B, the attack that took place that led to him being injured and being covered in dust was an attack by the Free Syrian Army, by the opposition, the Wahhabis, the so-called moderate rebels, who blew up a plant with all these chemicals that are stored in it. So not only was the U.S. lying about who actually did this attack, it was their forces who did this attack and hurt this boy. But B, they lied about who him and his family were. Like, his family, his dad actually, after this attack, like if you check some of the interviews, I think they're on RT and some other networks, his dad, after this attack, after this image came out, was like, I don't know what y'all are talking about. Like, we support Assad. We support Assad because he prevents these sort of terrorist attacks from happening to us. We want peace and stability. But you guys are using and manipulating the image of my son for empire. And it's just insane, because if you look back, nobody takes the time to go back and correct it. There's no correct, but it gets imprinted in your mind as this little boy is a victim of Assad. And it's fucking insane to just think about that, right? Because that's how it works. Meanwhile, we're distracted and we're overstimulated with so much information that we're never going to take the time back to really understand what's been going on. And another thing I wanted to share is also there's this interesting, one of the biggest like kind of errors on the part of the imperialists that they did with the psychological operation was in 1990, basically in the lead up to the Gulf War, which was a horrible U.S. invasion in the Middle East, and they attacked Iraq, and they invaded and they killed a lot of people. It was this testimony by this young woman who her pseudonym at this testimony was Nayira al-Sabah. And basically, let me just read this article again, right? You know, all the people are going to be like, oh my God, that's Wikipedia. That's not reliable. You know, this is accessible on all their outlets if you want to, you know, fact check or triple check me. But basically, the Nayira testimony is one of the biggest flops of psychological operations by the empire. It was a false testimony given before a U.S. Congressional Human Rights Caucus on October 10, 1990, by a 15-year-old girl who was publicly identified at the time by her first name, Nayira. The testimony was widely publicized and was cited numerous times by U.S. senators and President George H.W. Bush in their rationale to support Kuwait in the Gulf War, basically in their rationale to invade the Middle East, to occupy that area. In 1992, it was revealed that Nayira's last name was al-Sabah and that she was the daughter of Saud al-Sabah, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, which was allied with the U.S. with imperialism. Furthermore, it was revealed that her testimony was organized as part of the Citizens for a Free Kuwait public relations campaign, which was run by the American public relations firm Hill and Knowlton for the Kuwaiti government. Following this, al-Sabah's testimony has come to be regarded as a classic example of modern atrocity propaganda. So basically, she lied about all these things that Iraqi soldiers were doing. One of the biggest aspects, she said that she saw Iraqi soldiers taking babies out of incubators at a hospital in Kuwait, which ended up being false and ended up not being true. So I want to play a clip of that testimony, and then we'll talk about how they use emotion to try to promote regime change and propaganda.
Our final witness is also using an assumed name, and again, we ask our friends in the media to respect the need for her to protect her family. And we finally call on Nayira to testify.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Nayira, and I just came out of Kuwait. My mother and I were in Kuwait on August 2nd for a peaceful summer holiday. My older sister had a baby on July 29th, and we wanted to spend some time in Kuwait with her. I only pray that none of my 10th grade classmates had a summer vacation like I did. I may have wished sometime that I could be an adult, that I could grow up quickly. What I saw happen to the children of Kuwait and to my country has changed my life forever. It has changed the life of all Kuwaitis, young and old. We are children no more. My sister, with my 5-day-old nephew, traveled across the desert to safety. There was no milk available for the baby in Kuwait. They barely escaped when their car was stuck in the desert sand, and help came from Saudi Arabia. I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country. The second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
She should get a Grammy for that performance. Some of the best acting I've seen. All of this ended up being bullshit, being nonsense. And what happened as a result is that the U.S. invaded and occupied Iraq for many years, many decades, still are there, still are destroying that area, which is considered some of the birthplace of many amazing civilizations. Really disgusting stuff to see, and how they use children, empathy, emotion to subvert and to promote empire. Comrade Erica, your thoughts and analysis of all that?
Yeah, it's always children. Because there was a little girl in Syria as well. I forget her name, and then there was the girl from North Korea, who's so there's always children involved, but they always use student movements as well. When you were talking earlier, I was thinking about the newly passed America Competes Act that just passed in the House, and part of that budget is to directly fund NGOs and USAID. One section in it about Africa specifically says to give support for young African leaders initiatives. also require the USAID administrator to establish regional centers in Africa to provide in-person and online training. And that's where the money is going for. They're doing things similar in Latin America. So all these NGOs, I think that it's when we look at social media in contrast to the ways that the youth and students movements are being used, it's something that we should be really alerted and really really start to pay attention to. And another thing I was thinking of as well when we talk about youth, I was thinking about that the Russian TikTok. Salifu and I have been talking about that TikTok with that black girl for some days now. Not not specifically because a lot of what was said was untruth, but the way that it was said and the way that it caught on, and it's still catching on. I mean, she's being promoted now on on mainstream media as this is the way that news should be reported. But she's running state lines. So if this is the way that our youth is accepting this news, then we already are starting off really bad because we're not starting off from any kind of historically concrete place. We're not starting off with any facts. Where and there and the purpose or utility of that video is to pull at that that empathy, that emotion, to find some connection. Like, oh, she's a black girl like me, and she knows what she's talking about. Like, you know what I'm saying? So that's the type of the type of psyop that's occurring now. But I do find significance in that it's always youth movements. It's always these random little children that you don't get any other information about. Like you don't get any history of these children. You don't hear anything about their families except for the one parent that's present that brings them. So it's always like a mom, right? They don't have a dad typically, or if they did have parents, or now they're orphans because of what happened. But they always do find these little obscure children. I think that the little girl in Syria, she got a lot of reception from like J.K. Rowling was supporting her and and
Wow.
promoting yeah. So so I think that that's something that we really really need to stay on top of and really need to pay attention to because one, it does work. it it very much does work, but it's so prevalent because there I guess I don't want to say children are more susceptible because I just, given the amount of adults that are passing and sharing that TikTok around, I don't think it's an issue of children being more susceptible. But I think the utility of children, I'm thinking of the Simpsons episode um, where well, not even the episode, but just Ned Flanders' wife who's somebody please think of the children. Like, just like that sort of empathy pulling thing. Like, that's why they always have to use children or youth movements, right? Because I think also the intention of using youth movements is to say like, these old guards, like these older people are just trying to guard a liberation and the youth know what's going on and the youth knows how to drive a liberation home or the youth are the future type of thing without really any consideration of what's actually happening with the education of our youth and the direction of our youth. Because yeah, they are our future, but that can go either way if we are not the guidance for them. But I think they play on that, right? Especially the ways that we see that what is it, the boomer shit. So they do play on on that a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point because they like to contrast. It was a tactic that was used also against the Soviet Union and China during the 80s and the 90s, portraying the Marxist-Leninist governments as old, as conservative, as stuck in their ways, as reactionary, and portraying the liberal hipster youth as progressive and democratic and freedom-loving. And I think it's also how they use age. They also another thing that they use as well is religion. And obviously, like for the case of like China, like this is one image that became really well known and seen. It says it's a Muslim woman with a hijab, and it says China is committing genocide. And basically, she has a flag of the Uyghurs, and saying that China is murdering Muslims and locking them up in concentration camps, based on a lot of faulty evidence coming from think tanks and NGOs that have lied several times. Amnesty International and all these other institutions promoting this idea, like wanting to sympathize. We also saw that in Libya too, right, where they tried to say that Gaddafi was murdering other Muslims and that he was horrible. This is another one about the Uyghurs. It's a young Uyghur lady that has a sign that says "Uyghur Lives Matter" with the U.S. flag in the back and the Uyghur flag. Just the branding, right? So here it's kind of like the age, and the other sense they're using religion. And so any way they could find their entry point, right? To weaponize empathy, to weaponize all of these different things. It's just pretty insane. Comrade Salifu, your thoughts on also how is it that people fall for this, right? Like, because it's been done over and over and over and over again. Why do you think people keep falling for it? Why do you think it's unfortunate? I don't want to be a dick also. Like, I don't want to be those people who are like, oh, I'm smarter than you, I'm better, but like why do you think it is that even sometimes in the quote unquote left in the US, like sometimes people fall for these things?
Okay, I have a lot of thoughts about this. I'm gonna try to be concise. I think that one of the biggest issues that exists for people who live inside the US is that they have no idea where they are. Like, people, we live here, we like walk around every day, we like know there's like some bad things about it, but people aren't really internalizing that they live in Babylon. Like, that's the best way that I can like put it when I'm trying to talk about this. Sometimes like people will know all these statistical and sort of fact-based things about the United States and have a very hard time internalizing that the place that they live in is not just not a good place, but it is like the worst place. It is like there is no worse place currently in the world or historically that has ever existed than the place that you live right now. And a part of that, I think, is that I think existence, the only way to explain it is that existence inside of the United States itself is a psyop. To live here is to be under perpetual psychological operation. I feel like that shows up in the right, because they are delusional as fuck about what's going on. Even though they're organized, they're strategic, they have everything going on, but when you listen to the things that they're talking about, it's like y'all aren't even on the same planet as the rest of us. But when it comes to the left, let's think about it now. We have people in the US who call themselves socialists. They call themselves like anarchists. They claim to have read Marx. They claim to have read Lenin. And then every 4 years, they allow themselves to be swept up in the concept that they actually voted for somebody to become the president. Like, do you know how insane that is? Like, to know how monopoly capital works, to know how finance capital works, right? To understand that you live in an oligarchy, and then every 4 years you convince yourself that you're going to the polls to make a difference. That's madness. That is so crazy. It's like it shows up in all these ways. I think Erica pointed out that it shows up in the way that people use children. Culture is a huge way that it's used here in the United States. And when I speak about culture, I want to speak real quickly just about like this amorphous idea of Black culture, right? Because that shit has been completely taken from whatever its original roots were and weaponized completely against us, weaponized completely against African people in the US. So when I say it's being weaponized against us, they can only do this because, like they pointed out in that video you showed us at the beginning, they test these things, they study these things, they look and they understand. They want to understand where the weak points are, where are the points that we can exploit. For African people in the US, historically, we have been underrepresented in every field, not just television, but professions, all these things. A huge part of the psychological operation against us in the US right now is representation. I'm going to go to my grave screaming this on Telegram with Erica. We talk about this every single day. I'm so tired of representation. I don't want to be seen no more. Take me off everything. because what's happening is they're exploiting this desire, which is a real desire, right? Like I didn't grow up in the 50s and the 60s before Black people were all over TV, so I can't tell people that was wrong to want these things. That want was a real want, but today the way that it's being used is they understand and they know all they want is to see themselves. So we can just give them visuals and we can just let them see themselves. Like we can hold off potential rebellion. We can stave off a good deal of mistrust and righteous anger if we just give them a Supreme Court justice, right? If we just give them a president, if we give them some judges, if we give them mayors, and none of these things have anything to do with sort of like anything real or material. It's just representation for representation's sake. I wrote about this and had opportunity to talk about this a little bit earlier in the year, but corporations like McDonald's just like seize on Black culture to like sell us shit food that's killing our communities, and then turn around and make reports saying that it's the African American diet that is causing all of these, you know, these high blood pressure and things in their communities. Meanwhile, it's not our collard greens, right? It's not rice. It's not having fried chicken once a week. It's literally fucking McDonald's. And then they turn around and they fund the think tanks that produce the information that says it's us and it's y'all. And they're using Black culture to sell us cryptocurrency and banking and shit. Like, why is Megan Thee Stallion on Twitter giving me advice to invest in Bitcoin? This doesn't make sense, but it works because they've exploited a real sort of need that has existed historically. But also, this is the last thing I'm gonna say because I know I've been talking for a while. But when we talk about Black American patriotism or African American patriotism, I feel like people in these conversations, we always run far to the ADOS, the American descendants of slavery movement, the FBA, the foundational Black American, those sort of like, oh, we were here first, or we deserve a piece of the pie thing. But there is a much smaller and everyday, not talked about and not challenged brand of like just regular African American nationalism that does wrap itself in the flag of the United States and does create entry points for that TikTok video that Erica is talking about, right? Because we move from this position of the 60s where you have organizations like SNCC who are young African people in the United States standing up on the world stage saying, hell no, we won't go. You see that shit everywhere now. That was the rallying cry against Vietnam. You know what I mean? You have organizations like SNCC that were destroyed and completely taken apart for taking a hardline stance on Palestine and Palestinian resistance and against Zionism. And then today, what we have is like an African American population that largely sees our fate, our identity tied to the existence of the U.S. empire. So, like that girl said in the video, if Big Daddy Biden is like, oh, I gotta pull up on Big P, then we like, yeah, we all in the Twitter quote comments like, yeah, Russia is a problem. We got to take Russia out. Fuck China. And it's like, y'all, how did we get here? But it's all one big psychological operation. Just the sheer existence, just sheerly living in the United States is one big psychological operation.
Wow, powerful. So Comrade Salifu always bringing that amazing stuff, and it reminds me of that movie, The Truman Show, where it's like he's being recorded in all these angles, and living in Babylon, living in the empire, the belly of the beast, is really a psychological operation. Like you said, we're inundated every second of every day. That's why it must have been powerful when you went to Goa to not see billboards and ads everywhere, because when you walk here in the US, you kind of forget like how often you're bombarded every few seconds with media and propaganda and nonsense that is intended to basically manipulate your thoughts and how they subvert. Because the diet thing is such a great aspect to it as well. It's very demonic with the food in particular, because in the US, Black and Latino communities have, unfortunately, some really high rates of diabetes and heart disease. But that's not because of our foods, right? That's not because of rice, beans, and collard greens and corn and stuff that's indigenous to us. But it's because of this processed junk that was created by Babylon fed to us, where they use propaganda to make us think that that has value, that has nutrition. So we're forced to consume their garbage, and then they blame it back on us. It's some really demonic, dark shit. And I'm glad you mentioned the whole thing about also using figures in popular culture. This is a tweet. Megan Thee Stallion, the Hot Girl Coach is officially on Team Cash App to celebrate. I'm giving 1 million in Bitcoin to as many hotties as I can. We'll be giving out this 1 million units until it's gone. So drop your Cash App below. Bitcoin Meg to get a piece. And how, in a way, it's kind of like grooming, right? Like, not necessarily in the quote unquote pedophile way, but like grooming, where like you have these organic, popular artists who come up naturally. They have talent, they have skill. And then as they enter Babylon, as they enter these ranks, these parasitic capitalist imperialists are like, ooh, how can we use her to promote our agenda and Bitcoin and become a crypto colonizer? And so slowly, all these people, like good-hearted people who are into her music and stuff like that, they become swayed into like, oh, maybe I should invest in Bitcoin. Maybe I should do this, and so it's sort of like what they call pacing and also grooming, right? Where you're kind of like you're picking these people who are popular and then moving them in a direction that fits your agenda to sort of promote that. And Comrade Chris, Durán, you're somebody as well. Like we talk about this all the time, how in academia, like how they basically use psychological operations to make people oppose revolutionary governments that are doing the very things that these so-called liberal professors claim to be for: environmentalism, indigenous rights. Why do you think so many people, fall for all of these psychological operations? And what are some psychological operations that you see happening today that maybe we're not even aware of?
Well, I think a lot of it, at least in like this period, goes back to like, again, the time of like the mid 20th century and like the aim of like not just these psychological operations by like the CIA like internationally, but also like FBI programs here that also sought to destroy movements and destroy people who were in these spaces in academia who had any kind of grounding in movements or any kind of like real analysis. So like by the 80s, you see even academia in fields like Latin American studies or Africana studies or whatever, you see a lot of the writing itself also gets a lot of gets watered down as well. And so I think it kind of just goes back to that full-on assault that is aimed at preventing the next generation of inheriting these kinds of ideas and inheriting that analysis and that idea of even like why even why some of these fields even exist in college campuses that are they're inherently bound up with anti-colonial movements that were happening in the 60s. So I mean, I think it's very easy to appeal to like especially younger people in academia who then go into these what remains of these spaces, because you're then either for the most part appealing to like a very sort of light, like progressive, potentially like potentially revolutionary consciousness, or you're appealing to someone who's kind of like ultra left and kind of like lives in their own little Maoist wonderland, judge every existing revolutionary process on some puritanical basis that doesn't exist or is grounded in any reality of the global South. And again, that's why like I get so annoyed a lot of times with like the whole argument about like extractivism, because it's not like in 10 years Evo Morales is going to like change the entire economic dynamic of Bolivia so that somehow it's not an export economy, and people don't appreciate that when it comes to like situations like even like Venezuela or like Cuba. Like it's not like a lot of times these countries have the option of like, oh, if they just diversify their economies and if they just stop digging into the ground. And it's like, well, the demand for all that shit is here. It's not, the demand for tourism in Cuba is not, in Cuba, it's here. It's in Europe. The demand for oil, the demand for whatever, all these resources. And so, while they're criticizing these industries, they're also not even dealing with the reality of like, okay, how are we actually going to feed like these millions of people? And again, because there is no grounding or the very rarely is any grounding in, say, movements here, because again, at the same time, while the United States assaults, movements and has assaulted movements across the world, it does the same thing here. And then it funnels activism into the NGO industrial complex. The idea that, again, NGO activists should lead the way. I think, like even the new president of Chile, a lot of people are so excited about him because, oh, he was a student activist. It's like, yeah, but everyone's a student activist in college.
Right.
Everyone in Chile specifically was a student activist. And, again, they don't even investigate, like, for example, what kind of principles he actually has, whether he's in solidarity with any anti-imperialist movements. And then, again, if we're not engaging from that basis of, like, basic principles, then, it's hard to really have a real discussion within that. So, I mean, it's pretty easy, especially for, like, college youth, because, again, you can appeal to identity, you can appeal to aspirations within capitalism. Like Nixon's use of capitalism in the 70s is very, apparent now, like using crypto, so again, there's different ways to like get to people who would be potentially, interested in revolutionary politics. And then a lot of people who are, already involved or interested, then they'll assault them in different ways. Like, when you go back and you look at COINTELPRO and the methods of like, psychological or chemical warfare that they used against people who were in groups like the Panthers or the Young Lords. And, how that still, it's not like they stopped. Like, after the many members of the Panther 21, were still like sought after by the FBI, like, decades after, the Black Panther Party, even ceased to exist. So it is continual, and it's it's a continual assault of it's like trying to diminish people's like ability to collectively have this ideology. So
beautifully said. And one of the peoples and figures within, in particular the Latino community that I despise now. I don't know if y'all have heard of him, Residente. He is a white Puerto Rican who basically appropriates hip hop. Yeah, I'm sure Comrade Salifu has probably heard of him too. Residente. First of all, I mean, here's the thing, right? Residente, he's a Puerto Rican rapper, a white Puerto Rican rapper who many have criticized for basically appropriating an African genre and making millions out of it, but with a progressive face. Because a lot of his previous music was like protest music, right? And I'm glad Chris hit on something important. It's like, you can call yourself a protester, an activist, a campaigner, but what does that really mean, right? What are you protesting for or against? What are you campaigning for or against? What are you activating the masses for or against? And I think this is another part of the psychological operation that has to be mentioned, is what I like to call like the myth of the middle, the myth of not being left or right. And he's a classic example of this, because Residente, he's somebody who has made a living, literally made millions off of stealing a genre that's, first of all, not even his, and second of all, using themes in that genre that portray himself as a leftist, as a revolutionary. And so this is a post from Instagram that Residente made a few years back when the protests were heating up against President Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. That's hilarious. David said, dude looks like Mark Wahlberg. That's fucking funny. Yeah, he does look like Mark Wahlberg. So Residente, he posted this on Instagram, right? And again, right, this is a guy who portrayed himself as like, yeah, I'm against the system. I'm against fight the man, fight the power. And he posted this thing. He said, no, I don't. I'm going to translate it to English because he wrote it in Spanish. He said, no, I don't support Maduro. No, I don't support that Trump is meddling in the country, que le da la gana de decidir, that basically, that they're figuring out who their president is. No, I don't know Guaido. I'm not a Chavista. I'm not communist. I'm not socialist. I'm not on the right. I'm not on the center. And I will never support an invasion of Latin America. And that video, basically, in that post, he's basically promoting all this imperialist talking points. Maduro's a dictator. The people are rising up against him. This U.S.-backed quote unquote uprising, but then he's taking this idealist position saying, I'm not left or right. I've heard people say this, right? They're like, I'm not in favor of the left or the right. I'm in favor of the bottom going against the top. Like all this nonsense, like word magic to make it seem like they don't
Neither
occupy a
Beijing
position.
nor Washington.
Right, exactly. Neither Beijing nor Washington, neither Moscow nor Washington. And I think that's nowadays one of the popular methods of the psychological operations, where they put figures like this to be like, oh, I'm neither this nor that, I'm in the middle. But objectively, they're still supporting empire because they're still promoting the same talking points. And then one last thing I wanted to share before we wrap up here. There's this great, one of my favorite, and I love sharing this quote. It's to this day is still one of my favorite quotes of all time. Malcolm X: "This is the media, an irresponsible media. It will make the criminal look like he's the victim, and make the victim look like he's the criminal. If you aren't careful, the media will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing." And he also added, "This is sort of a propaganda tactic that I would call psychological warfare." Right on the money. Years before all this was created, Malcolm X ahead of the game as always. I think hands down, this is probably one of the best quotes about media and propaganda. He sums it up beautifully there, just explaining that whole strategy, right? Of like kind of like how Comrade Salifu was saying, inverting, like mirroring, like taking from you the good and taking the bad from them and labeling it back on you. So just to wrap up here, Comrade Erica, your final thoughts on psychological warfare, on psychological operations, and how we can avoid these and the best ways to combat them.
I think one of Noam Chomsky's best work or utilities of his work was his work around psychological warfare in the media. I know there's a video on YouTube that breaks it down in like 5 minutes, but I think that what he notes about its use, the way that it's used, is very important to help us understand the ways that it is expanding with social media. Also, Devin Springer, my good comrade, they do a lot of great work. They, in fact, wrote a piece that's on Hood Communist about TikTok and how TikTok is being used and that sort of same sort of psychological warfare, not just with political TikToks, but what it's doing with our children, what it's doing to us in general. Um, so that I think that's worthy of checking out. And then I know you had Yoli on here to talk about Ethiopia, but Yoli, my first interaction with Yoli, we were on a panel together with Elaine Brown, and we were talking about generational organizing, intergenerational organizing, and Yoli was the first person I ever heard talk about the student activist. Um, what was it? The student activist industrial complex, and that there's a whole industry of them just churning out these particular type of students in academia who are activists, but then they go on to work for Amnesty International or the human rights. There's a direct pipeline to that. Um, and these are all uh, institutions that push for regime change, like they do soft coup pushes and such and things like that under the human rights endeavor. Um, so yes, I really value this conversation. I'm very appreciative of Salifu also highlighting that this is a psyop because I think that's not really understood, especially when we don't engage other parts of the world. And our only engagement of the other parts of the world are through these mediums, are through mainstream media that doesn't do any journalism. It's literally reading off of the state, the State Department, memo. They're not, they don't. I don't know if anyone saw that clip of Ned being challenged by the AP reporter, but I mean the shock and the arrogance from Ned, like, how dare you? Like, we told you what you were supposed to know. What are you asking me more questions for? We already said it. And I think those little instances highlight exactly what we're saying here, how common it is, how insidious it is. And then we do have to recognize that we live in a thoroughly embedded anti-communist nation, right? That sees any project that's rejecting capitalism. It might not even be a communist or socialist project, but if it's seemingly rejecting capitalism and pushing for a multipolar world, then they are going to be sources of targets. And when we look at, and I encourage everyone to please go and look at Black Alliance for Peace's statement on the American for Peace Act, because it lays out exactly what we're talking about, what that money is intended to do, and how they plan to use it in Taiwan, on the continent, and in Latin America, to create these same sort of psychological um, operations.
Beautifully said. By the way, Eric, I love your shirt. What does it say? Proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. That's a fresh ass shirt. Damn, I want to get that. That's awesome. Yeah, and thank you for shouting out. Shout out to Hood Communist Black Alliance for Peace. Really great, amazing work that's going on. And when Comrade Salifu was talking about how we live in Babylon, I think that's such a great analysis and such a great point to mention, because this is basically how I see capitalist society now. And people, it's like signs everywhere: consume, obey, conform, buy. But in reality, they're just rebranded with products and with all these things. But this is really what it comes down to: stay asleep, right? And in many ways, people don't see how tyrannical capitalist society is. When you go against the grain, you're quickly removed from the system. But a lot of times, I couldn't have said it better myself. Like, than how you said it, Comrade Salifu. Like, we are living now in a psychological operation. Your final thoughts and analysis on all this?
I think I appreciate y'all doubling down on the living in a psyop thing. So I feel like I'm always, well, not always, but I am committing to always trying to reach that person that you talked about, Ramiro, that's like, oh, I'm neither left nor right, all that. It's nonsense, right? And so I feel like if you are somebody that's like that, you are that way because there is a tradition or a practice, I feel, in the US that is always trying to steer people away from taking principled positions on things. You feel that you should always be in the middle of the road because you are conditioned, like from movies to books to TV. The sensible character, the sensible person is always the person that's not trying to take a stance either way. I need you to understand that that's not realistic. In the country that we live in, there's material conditions. In the world that we live in, the planet that we live on, there's material conditions. There is good and there is bad. There are things that are objectively good and there are things that are objectively bad. There are things that are more good than bad, and there are things that are more bad than good. The United States is an objectively bad place. The only people that it is good for, the only people that is working in the interest of, is its ruling class, right? So the only way that you are going to be able to sort of combat the negative things that you experience in your life, the negative impacts that you have, is going to be by rejecting some of this individualist messaging that we get. I'm always talking to Erica about every music these days. Every song is like, fuck that nigga, I don't need nobody, I don't need family, I got it out the mud, I got it on my own. Like, this is what you are being indoctrinated with all the time. You have to reject it because we cannot make it out of this thing that feels and operates very much like a simulation, like on our own. You have to link up with other people to do it. You have to be a part of an organization that is engaging in some sort of regular political education process, that is encouraging you to be out and struggle with people over ideas. It's not going to happen on some every man for himself, let's just all pick up a hammer type thing. You have to do these things in collective. And when you start doing those things, you will start to there's going to be this cloud that kind of lifts from over your brain, and you're going to be like, wow, I see it. But you have to trust me enough to actually just try that. Just try on the come to the far left position. Just try it on for 30 days. I'll give you your money back. If it don't work after 30 days, I'll give your money back. 30 days free trial. Just try it on. I promise you, things are going to start to become clearer, and the world is going to make more sense. But you have to take a position. Historically, the people who have always sat in the middle of the road, when you look at revolutionary societies throughout history, they have always gone to the side of the right. They've never stood in defense of or joined or defended the people on the left who objectively were fighting for the right thing. They've always gone to the right. You don't want to be that person. So you have to take a position. That's the only way to not be manipulated fully by the psychological operation that is the United States.
Wow, beautifully said. And we got that Salifu guarantee wear programs for 30 days, your money back. Become a communist for 30 days. Hit up Comrade Salifu. Got that 1-800 communist. We'll set up that hotline for you. So well said, Comrade Salifu. So much amazing truth and amazing revolutionary ideas. And I'm so glad you said that. You have to take a position. And I think it bothers me when people are like, everything in moderation. We have to balance capitalism and social. It's like you said, one is objectively good, one is objectively bad. And I think people in the US who don't see how bad capitalism and imperialism are for the rest of the world, they have that position because their frame of analysis and thought is only within their immediate surrounding, right? So somebody in the US, like a wealthier white person, will be like, well, it's working great for me, so why the fuck, should I care about capitalism? But it's like, go to like Congo, go to Africa, Asia, Latin America, and see just how horrible capitalism and neoliberalism is for the majority of people in the world. And you'll understand just how radical capitalism is. Like, that's the thing people don't get. Like, capitalism is a radical, tyrannical, authoritarian system for most people in the world. But if you're in Babylon, if you're in the belly of the beast, as Marx talks about in Capital, if you're drunk off of capital, if you're in the core, you're not going to see that. Your senses are going to be so diluted, like when you're fucked up, that you're not going to be able to understand that. And it's so important for people to really travel, go to the world, and look at Haiti, right? How has capitalism worked for the people of Haiti? Like, not at all, So it's important to mention that. I think that's such a great point. And just also wrapping up here, because I think Comrade Emma in the chat had an interesting comment. Said, I think lived experience and picking people to talk about their experience is part of psyops, and I think to a degree, right? We also we also don't want to kind of take it to the extreme where they're like, oh, forget all identities or lived experiences, because at the same time, like, if I'm talking about, I'll never know what it means to be a trans person or LGBTQ person who's been oppressed in a certain situation. So I'm not going to be like, oh, this or that. But we can see how in many ways, especially with liberal imperialism, they've weaponized and subverted lived experience for their regime change efforts. So I don't know, Chris, if you want to just give some final thoughts on that and just on psychological operations in general.
Well, before I guess give my last words, I would like to just express how appreciative I am to be in this space right now, and to Comrade Salifu and Erica. I've read hood comments for a while, and for a couple of years now, and looked up to y'all, your work, for a while. So, but with that being said, I think a lot of it kind of goes back to, again, not just developing the analysis, but like also it was kind of touched upon, but like doing it also like collectively, like doing it also like on the ground, like when you're engaging. I think getting grounded in like a lot of like serve the people programs and like engaging in like political education, structures through that, and trying to be deliberate about, who you can affect locally and who you can build relationships with. I think that goes a long way towards like developing that whole, revolutionary nationalist and, communist and internationalist positioning that is kind of missing. And, it also, it does involve people, again, into, building collective relationships and also engaging with, ideological struggle, which is also needed. And, it's not necessarily, something that has to be, constantly like, like shitting on other people who are saying like, I'm smarter than you, but, just in the sense that like, we're all supposed to be learning and growing with this together. And it does bring about also a lot of clarity, because one of my favorite quotes that I was thinking of this entire time was a quote by Kwame Ture, and he says that like not everyone fighting against the same thing is necessarily for the same thing. And so like you see a lot of that where like everyone now is like anti-capitalist, everyone now is anti-racist, which is, you know, one of the people's favorite thing now. But again, and again, the whole thing, everyone is against oppression, everyone is against exploitation, so they immediately move to that sort of like all states are bad position. They immediately empower like the forces of reaction without really knowing it. And again, what is objectively true is that when you support, you know, or when you give criticisms or certain types of criticisms towards revolutionary movements, you know, it empowers a certain, you know, it empowers a wave of reaction that, you know, you're not actually helping a lot of times, and people don't, you know, people don't get that sometimes. But yeah, I think that it really does kind of just goes back to that grounding aspect, and, you know, just engaging with, you know, just people locally, and then also trying to design, you know, some kind of structure, you know, principled programs around that. So.
Most definitely. No, great point, compañero Chris. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I just do, before I head out right now, I just do want to give a shout out. This is one of the best articles I've read in a long time, by Comrade Erica, The Limits of Lived Experience on Hood Communist. Please check out that article. Maybe in the future, Comrade Erica, we could even do a whole stream about it, about the limits of lived experience. And I think it gives a really great analysis of balancing, because on the one hand, you do have sectors of the white left who are like, yeah, fuck all of that quote unquote identity politics, do away with it. We're all just oppressed workers equally. There's no difference between race. We're all just workers fighting against the bosses, which is one rightist error. But then you also have, on the other hand, people who only, and I love your term, Comrade Erica, identity reductionism, you know, who only reduce everything just to your race or to your nationality. And so that's another kind of error. And I think this article is an amazing communist analysis of the principled and scientific position that as communists we should take in understanding both the race and class dynamic, and how both can be incorporated into communist organizing and fighting against imperialism. But comrades, it's been really an honor, a pleasure having y'all on. I love y'all. You're amazing comrades, doing amazing work with just such an optimistic and mature and message. I love having you guys on, and hope to have you guys on soon. We spoke with comrades Erica Caines, Salifu Mack, and Chris Durán. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. To Big Teal, to David, to everybody who's been watching and listening. We're going to head out with a clip from this interesting movie called The Network, talking about mainstream media control. I hope you guys have an amazing weekend. Check out the PSYOPs, by the way, in the Super Bowl. It is Super Bowl Sunday, so have on your PSYOP glasses just for all of the propaganda that we're going to be fed today about, you know, the Super Bowl in America and the national anthem and all that. So maybe we could even do something like that in the future. But peace out, comrades. I hope you have a great weekend, and take care. Love y'all. Peace out.
A rich little man with white hair died. What has that got to do with the price of rice, right? And why is that woe to us? Because you people and 62 million other Americans are listening to me right now. Because less than 3% of you people read books. Because less than 15% of you read newspapers. Because the only truth you know is what you get over this tube. Right now, there is an entire generation that never knew anything that didn't come out of this tube. This tube is the gospel, the ultimate revelation. This tube can make or break presidents, popes, prime ministers. This tube is the most awesome goddamn force in the whole godless world. And woe is us if it ever falls into the hands of the wrong people. And that's why woe is us that Edward George Ruddy died. Because this company is now in the hands of CCA, the Communication Corporation of America. There's a new chairman of the board, a man called Frank Hackett, sitting in Mr. Ruddy's office on the 20th floor. And when the 12th largest company in the world controls the most awesome goddamn propaganda force in the whole godless world, who knows what shit will be peddled for truth on this network?